just 10 minutes, you'll be ready to play the Cadillac of chess openings, the Nimzo-Indian with either color. The Nimzo-Indian arises after knight c3, bishop b4. And we're going to cover some different options that white can play and also some of black's responses. You're really going to love it. The great thing about the Nimzo-Indian, which was really developed by Aaron Nimzovich, actually I was very recently recommending a student to play, to play for Nimzovich's games to really understand this opening. Basically, the nice thing about it is how flexible it is. White can choose from a lot of different kind of setups here. But black also has a very wide choice as well. If you take a position like this, for example, there's really a lot of different ways that you can kind of play it here. And basically, the one I'm going to be recommending is to play d takes c4 when I go for this classical development. And the reason I'm kind of suggesting this move order, playing for the Karpov variation with b6, and then developing knight to one of these squares depending on how they play it, is because if you start with the more common move of c5, which is an old main line with castles and so on and so forth, well, you do give white the extra option to play c takes d5 and transition into a position against the isolated queen's pawn, which granted should still be fine for black, but white does have a little bit of practical pressure, and just taking on c4 first avoids that problem. Also, if you're enjoying the video, do make sure to leave a like. Also, subscribe if you are new to the channel. If they played a3, it's going to be a similar concept that, again, we want to play d takes c4 and not let them kind of take us. Because what we're going to do is we're going to play queen c7 and put pressure on their bishop that way. They will often move the bishop out of the way to avoid that discovered attack. Make sure that this is defended as well. But then we can hit back in the center with e5, and that is going to give us a reasonable position. I can recommend the games of Alexei Serrano from white's point of view to explore this more deeply. Again, knight g2 just kind of gives you an improved version of the IQP, where the knight really belongs on f3. And if they take first to avoid the move dc4, it's very easy to play moves like bishop d6, and they can't really go f3 or and e4 so easily, because c5 just gives you a very good counterplay in the center. So it's a pretty decent overview of the main lines of the Rubinstein. The c5 move order is also possible, but does give white some good extra options. If they play a move such as knight e2, trying to get the bishop pair, we can just move the bishop back, and again, this sort of this Carlsbad position, we know a Carlsbad pawn structure. It's just a good version of an exchange QGD, because the bishop clearly is not as good on c1 as it would be on g5 in the QGD version. The modern mainline these days is actually bishop d2. We're just trying to get the bishop pair advantage, but of course black can also move the bishop away even voluntarily as such. And a position like this is kind of the main battleground. Like bishop b7 might look a little bit weird the first time you see it, but it's so that we can kind of go c5 and hit back in the center, about our bishop being sidelined. It's a position where white's position is probably a bit easier to play, but if you look at it deeply enough with the engine, it does eventually come to an equality. So definitely a reasonable option for us in that respect. Knight g4 and the line goes on. Also, there are other options against the Rubinstein. You're not limited to castles, even though it's what most of the top GMs play. You can also play moves like c5, and they can go for either the Hubner system with, something like this, where you give up the bishop pair, but you get the sort of dark squared center to kind of play against their bishops or structure. The move knight 2 is a bit more popular at high level, but then there's this modern bishop a5 that some strong GMs have been playing, just not letting white untangle the knights, and that does prove a quite reliable equalizer if you know what you're doing. And also, moves like b6 as well, like this can also be explored, and it's something that I have covered quite a bit in some resources for students in the past. Maybe I'll turn into a video topic of its own if enough of you request in the comments below. Because it's a very interesting idea as well to kind of go for the light squared sort of play in some lines. But anyway, let's also touch on some alternatives, because e3, even though Rubinstein is the move that I played almost always as a junior, there are alternatives for white, and queen c2, the classical variation, and just trying to basically get the bishop pair without doubling the pawns with bc3. This is the main alternative, and once again, castling does prove to be the most flexible, albeit not the only move here. And then after a3 takes, the old main line was basically to play the move of b6 and kind of play these more strategic positions where, okay, white can play f3, they can also play e3. The general sort of contours is that, yeah, from the computer point of view, black is fine, but white does have the bishop pair and the space advantage, so they do have decent scope to, try to outplay while black tries to use their development in the center in different ways. But the move of d5, the Kramnik variation, is really the one that's kind of killed queen c2 as really a major try for an edge. The idea of d5 is basically twofold. The first is that if white just tries to keep the tension, we can kind of just go dc4 and just get very good counterplay with bishop a6 and eventually hitting back with c5 before white can develop the king side. Obviously, for advanced players, there's a lot more theory, but this is the basic conclusion. And, well, you can also play a move like b6 immediately, and yeah, it's a bit of a more flexible approach if you just want to reduce your theoretical workload, and is held up at a high level too. If they play cd5, you can kind of flick in this knight e4 and then take to sort of get this improved version of a sort of Rogozin or QGD type position. This sort of Kramnik's innovation, it really revitalized the move d5. And if you try to go bishop g5 first to avoid knight e4, it just turns out that even though dc4 is okay, you can also just play h6 and just have a very decent position with the it's sort of in a Rogozin kind of style with the exchange of the bishops on both knights, evening it out. White does have some alternatives like knight f3 and e4, but d5 tends to be a good reply, and there are some lines that that do get a bit sharp. Like from this position, you really should know your theory a bit before playing this as black. But if you do it does end up being totally fine and more or less worked out to a draw, like castles g5. It might look weird the first time you see it, but it just kind of liquidates everything very concretely. And if you're looking for a bit of a shortcut, you can either play something like c5 and kind of go for this more Queen's Indian style structure, but where rather than the old move b6, which have fallen a bit under a cloud, instead moves like knight c6 or d5 immediately are kind of the ways in which black is sort of able to prove equality if they play correctly. Also, d5 is fairly reliable. The idea is you can try to transpose into the Kramnik variation like we just saw, but you can also, if they take, play, just kind of like in a Rogozin. Like you basically have a Rogozin where, they didn't play knight f3. The queen is also a little bit misplaced on the soon-to-be-opened c-file. And while it's not the most trendy approach, in the old days, like 2010s, it was kind of shown that with a setup like this, like it's very systematic and just very easy to play for maintaining the balance as black. So that's kind of the reason why queen c2, of course, it's a very decent move. It leads to interesting positions, but black is also doing fine there. As for a move like knight f3, it really is a matter of taste which line you play, because there's going to be a lot of moves that are basically going to be fine. Obviously, white also keeps some flexibility that, so after c5, they might play g3, the Kasparov variation, to play in a kind of Catalan sort of style. But after b6, white sort of alternatives like e3 and queen b3 just don't really prove all that effective somehow. And if white does play the principal bishop g5, you can even just kick away the bishop before playing bishop b7. It just reduces some of white's kind of options with knight d2 and stuff. And the rising position is just fine for black in various ways. Like you can either take on g3 or keep the tension if you want to have a bit more of a fighting position. This latter approach does require a little bit more memorization, admittedly, to prove the equality. Just to quickly round up just a few of the other lines, like f3 is a move that the Kmok variation, which is a quite dangerous weapon, players like Mamedyarov, Eric Geisy, and some others have been quite successful with this idea. Basically, the choice is either to play d5 and kind of go into positions like this one, where you can choose between various knight moves. Even Carlsen played knight c7 a bit lately, but is probably a bit more of a drawing weapon. Or you can play something like c5 and just play very dynamically this kind of improved Blumenfeld, where white really wishes they could play knight to f3. And you can play castles if you're not afraid of e5, or you can play d6 first if you really want to avoid it. Again, a lot of sharp theory, but black is fine here if they know what they're doing. Also, the same issue is another system that's also quite sharp, and often white will here also go for f3 and e4, but there are a few good replies. You can either go c5 and just play these kind of positions where you are going to try to put pressure on the weak c4 pawn, or you can even just not fix the weakness on c4 and just kind of do it immediately. Like nowadays, the knight a5 move order is sort of proven a little more flexible than the bishop a6 one, but both of them are kind of fine if you know what you're doing. And finally, the Leningrad is just not really seen so much. Like if you kind of know the line with knight d7 and some of the tricks from there, you're basically just going to be more than fine. So that's all for the Nimzo-Indian. We did cover in 10 minutes. Do let me know in the comments below which opening you would like me to cover next in this series. I basically designed this series just so that rather than spending most of your time on openings and not working on things that really matter in chess, you can start playing your opening within 10 minutes and then focus on the stuff that's really going to lead to a big improvement in your games. With that being said, I'll see you in the next video. Take care.